Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Normally would imagine you know that I'm Rabbi David Kosak, but I've been away. So I'm Rabbi David Kosak, and it is lovely to see so many of your masks and faces each, and to be back. I am grateful to the Israel 360 committee and our amazing Neveh Shalom staff who've been working diligently behind the scenes to put this event together and to bring us Paul Margolis for what will be an evening of really beautiful and pellucid images. Paul shoots with silver film, the old standard. And when he and I were speaking about that, Paul has a love of analog film, is what I will call it, of old chemical film. He worked with digital in earlier days. And if you read his bio, it says, because it's more fun. But I'm going to go out on a little bit of a leaf and say that we all understand how a picture is worth 1,000 words. But there's something more when you're a photographer of people, and it is that what you are trying to capture is the human being and the human's story. And that is ultimately always an analog event, a real person in real space having a moment. And the photographer's job, like a little bit of resin, is to capture that insect in amber. It is to freeze time, and by doing so, to preserve a moment of life that otherwise might escape us and go by. When we speak about Israel, and Israel 360 has worked certainly with words and programs and speakers, it's to try to get beyond the headlines, which sometimes confuse, and to present us with a deeper vision and reality of Israel and its complexities. And I'm so grateful because the power of a photograph is to tell that story unvarnished. And yet at the same time, a photograph needs context. A photograph needs an explanation of what the photographer was feeling or thinking, and the photograph needs to have the circumstances in which it was taken be explained to us. So Paul Margolis's reputation as a photographer does not need me to speak about it. He is well known, well regarded. I remember some of your photos long before I really knew who you were, or before my dear friend Aliyah and I began planning this pre-pandemic, Aliyah, to begin to get you here. And with that said, I think I've said more than enough, and 1,000 words shall be turned over to Paul Margolis as he regales us with images of Israel and the people who call it home.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to my presentation this evening. I have to say, it is great to be in front of a live audience. It's been 2.5 years since I was able to look at people and have human interactions rather than being on Zoom. It's very, very gratifying. Before we get started, I have couple of questions. I'm curious about something. By a show of hands, how many of you have been to Israel? Wow, that's a pretty good percentage. How many of you have spent 6 months or more in Israel? Oh, also a good sprinkling. How many of you were either born or grew up there? Oh, nobody. Okay, I got one customer in the last place, but this is fine. So I see that a good number of you have experienced Israel in one way or another. I've called this project Israel Impressions because it isn't so much a comprehensive documenting of life in Israel as it is a collection of images that came my way and made impressions on me on a series of trips to Israel starting in 2013. These photographs are a small portion of the work that I did that show slices of everyday life in Israel. Let me give you a little bit of the background of my personal experience in Israel. In the late 1970s, I spent a year there, 6 months of which were in Haifa, in an absorption center, a Merkaz Klita for new immigrants. I was one of a handful of North and South Americans among several hundred refugees from the Soviet Union. And some of them were genuine refuseniks, but many of them were newly sprung from prisons, mental hospitals, and substance treatment facilities. They were a pretty wild crew, my fellow immigrants. We were all living together in a complex that had been a World War II era British Army hospital. And it was an experience that I've never forgotten. I was thrown in with Jews from very different cultures in a rundown neighborhood. Israel, then barely 30 years old, was still a rough-hewn country. I was overwhelmed by the complexities, and I didn't feel that I would ever be able to fit into this very different society. So my attempt at Aliyah didn't work out. And except for a brief trip in 1985, I didn't visit Israel again until 2013. In the intervening years, I did photojournalism and documentary photography, both of Jewish and non-Jewish subjects. My Jewish work took me to Cuba and Ireland to document the tiny Jewish communities there. And I did a project on Jewish poverty in New York. I also did journalism for several Jewish publications in the US and overseas, and more recently, I did the photography for a historical guidebook to the Lower East Side of Manhattan. I always meant to go back to Israel, but somehow the timing never quite worked out. On that first trip back after so many years, I found a modern, vibrant country that still retained many of the characteristics that I remembered from when I was a young man living there. I was fascinated by the diversity of people and cultures that make up 21st century Israel. Everywhere I turned, there was something that caught my eye and called out to be photographed. I worked in the streets, marketplaces, and homes with my quiet, discreet Leica cameras and black and white film, photographing in a fluid, fast-moving documentary style. I was returning to Israel every year around Sukkot before the pandemic to photograph, to see family and friends, and I've had several exhibits of my photography there. I'm hoping to be able to go back again this fall, depending on what the state of the world is. But, so that's a little bit about me and my experiences in Israel. Now let's go to the photographs. I'm fascinated by the older parts of Jerusalem and Machane Yehuda Market, and I keep going back to those places to photograph. There's a timeless quality to so much of Jerusalem, and I can feel the weight of history there more than any place else in the country. I feel that I've done a lot of my best work in Jerusalem, so this presentation is somewhat weighted towards those pictures. This is a woman buying bread in Machane Yehuda Market, which makes me think of the markets in the shtetls, the little towns of Eastern Europe, or maybe the Middle Eastern cities where Jews once lived. A bedding merchant, also in Machane Yehuda, he was lighting up the stub of his cigarette, and I asked if I could photograph him. A discussion in a pastry shop. They might have been talking about the price of pistachios or arguing about politics. A guitar player near David's Tower outside of the walls of the old city. He was playing for for shekels and dollars from the tourists and entertaining the two yeshiva girls with his combination of guitar and breath-powered keyboard instrument. Lunch delivery in the Arab quarter of the old city. I was fascinated by how the guy could balance the tray and wend his way through the crowds in the narrow streets there. So border guards and tourists in the old city. This picture is from November of 2015, during the stabbing and shooting attacks that were going on, the sort of the freelance intifada at the time. And we were advised to stay out of the old city. And we debated whether it was safe to go there. But then we decided that we weren't going to be scared off. Besides, I had promised a devoutly Catholic colleague that I would bring her back rosaries from the Holy Land. So she'd given me $100 bill and asked me to get as many rosaries as it would buy. In return, she and the women in her prayer group would pray for my continued health and safety. I thought that was a pretty good deal. That was worth taking a risk. So my companion has a longtime friend who owns a Christian religious article shop in the Christian quarter, and he gave me a good deal. That $100 bought a dozen rosaries. An olive seller in the market. This guy couldn't understand why I wanted to take his picture. I'm no movie star, he said, but he was gracious enough to indulge me, let me photograph him with his wares. Actually, he did become a sort of star. This picture was made into a 10-foot high banner that advertised an exhibit that I did in Los Angeles a few years later. Yeah. These are Christian pilgrims with a cross on the Via Dolorosa. I came across this group of Asian Christians carrying a wooden cross and making their way along the route that Jesus took to his crucifixion. And I couldn't help being curious about how much it costs to rent a cross and what sort of security deposit they needed to give. There's a Greek Orthodox priest also in that Christian quarter. As I'm sure all of you know, the anti-Israel rhetoric denounces the country as being a European colonialist apartheid state. I knew from my trips there that in reality, it's a very, very diverse place ethnically and otherwise. So before the trip that I made in 2016, I contacted a friend who works with schools and social service organizations. And I told him that I wanted to photograph a school with a diverse mixture of children studying and playing together. He got me into the Guatemala school in Jerusalem, where I spent a few hours photographing the kids. And one of the things that I've noticed over the years doing photography is that after a certain point, I become invisible. And people do whatever they're doing, and it's like I'm no longer there. So I caught this image of these four girls. That's one of my favorites from that day. And they just ignored me and started braiding each other's hair and behaving like young women at play always do. And you notice one is Ethiopian, another is Mizrahi, and two of them look like they're probably Ashkenazi. This is the festival of Sigid. Speaking of the ethnic diversity of Jews, here are Ethiopian Jewish women at prayer at the Sigid festival. This is a yearly gathering of about 15,000 Ethiopian Jews from all over the country who travel to Jerusalem to celebrate the giving of the Torah. They assemble on the Tayelet, the heights above the city, and this holiday is unique to the Ethiopian Jews, sort of their version of Simchat Torah or Shavuot. I was particularly impressed that many of the police and border guards who were protecting this gathering were Ethiopian, there to protect their people at this event. This last picture from Jerusalem is a Scotsman. I photographed him several years ago at a bus station. He was there in his full regalia, in his family kilt, to cheer on his football team that was playing against teams in Haifa and Jerusalem. And he was very friendly and probably happy to find another English speaker, and didn't mind my taking his picture. He said that he liked Israel. People had been very warm and welcoming to him. But there was one thing that annoyed him. People kept asking him if he was Irish. And in Israel, it's very easy and natural to strike up conversations with strangers and have them give you advice or opinions, whether you want them or not. And I was in the market in Machane Yehuda one evening, and I saw this ultra-Orthodox man with his daughter at a spice counter. And it was a scene that looked like something out of 150 years ago. It was just one of those things outside of modern times. And I raised my camera to take a picture, and he saw me and started walking towards me. I thought, oh no, he's going to give me grief for photographing them. And I really was trying to think of something innocuous to say, like, oh no, I wasn't photographing you. I was photographing the pile of ginger over there or whatever. But anyway, instead, he started telling me in heavily French accented English that he also had a Leica camera, the model after mine, and he regretted not having the time to use it, probably had a dozen children to support. So he had apparently done photojournalism, a reportage in France, and we switched to French, which is sort of my good second language. And I ended up admonishing him before I left to say, you know, it's a sin for a Leica to be unemployed. So let's move on to Tel Aviv and Yafo. But I'm not usually drawn to photographing the newer parts of cities. I usually look for those aspects that have survived into the 21st century from other times. For example, old Yafo appeals more to me than Tel Aviv. And I tend to find my subjects in the middle of traditional architecture rather than modern streetscapes. These are some of my favorite images from Tel Aviv and Yafo. A street scene in Tel Aviv. I like the juxtaposition of the Hasid, the young woman on the bicycle, and the early 20th century buildings in the background. So somehow it seemed like a microcosm of the complexity and diversity of life in Israel. And Israel is also filled with people who have unique and unusual talents. And this is Ellie Theodore. She is an aerialist. She sets herself up in trees and in structures, hangs upside down, and does a sort of like aerial act. And she rigged her ropes above the Rothschild Boulevard, so I could photograph her. And she was very happy hanging there like a bat a lot of the time. And At one point, she sat up, wrapped herself in the rope, and just sort of calmly sipped from a cup of coffee about 6 feet off the ground.
Oh, yeah, like a bat.
Like a bat, absolutely.
Like a bat, not that it takes the
These are sheshbesh, backgammon players in Yafo, in old Yafo. They're in front of an antique store, and they were absorbed in their game while waiting for customers, I imagined. Business must have been slow that day, or maybe there wasn't much demand for the life ring, searchlight, or the other treasures that they were selling. However, in other parts of Yafo, things are somewhat livelier. That Friday afternoons, when no one in Israel is working, is a time for birthday parties. And we stumbled onto this party for a guy named Udi. He encouraged me to photograph the festivities and then passed me the communal bottle of arak. So, l'chaim, Udi. Street singers in Yafo. These young women were singing for shekels in old Yafo. I like the way that the elements of the scene all fall together, sort of a frozen instant, like an instant frozen at 125th of a second. That they're the singers, the woman and her daughter watching, and in the background, the man putting on tefillin, all just frozen there for an instant that will never quite repeat itself in the same way. This is Sado. He is a seventh generation Israeli Arab fisherman whose family have fished out of Yafo probably since the Turks ran the place during the Ottoman Empire. And while I was photographing him, I couldn't help thinking of Jonah, who must have gotten onto a ship for his rendezvous with a whale, not so far from where I was standing on Sado's boat. In Tel Aviv and other parts of the country, there are pianos just randomly placed in train stations, and people of varying levels of skill just will sit down at the piano and tickle the ivories while they're waiting for a train. And it was interesting to see that some people were really terrible playing with two fingers, but this guy was a reasonably competent piano player. It was a pleasure to listen to him. So move on to Haifa. Haifa holds a special place in my thoughts about Israel. As I mentioned, I spent about 6 months there in an absorption center for new immigrants, the folks from the former Soviet Union who I mentioned. When I went to Haifa in 2013, I wanted to see the neighborhood, which is called Bat Galim, and look for traces of where I'd lived. And while every other place I saw in Israel had changed almost unrecognizably, Bat Galim was essentially the same rundown neighborhood that I remembered from many years earlier. The absorption center was gone, and there was a park in its place, but that was about it. There were the old style concrete buildings were there, kind of deteriorating. And I've heard that there's a lot of new construction in Bat Galim, and it has become the up and coming neighborhood in Israel and is more or less affordable. So if anyone wants to speculate on property in Israel, say my advice is to look at Bat Galim. It's a lot better now than it was 30 years ago. My companion has known the former mayor of Haifa, Yona Yahav, for many years. And on one of our trips, he was nice enough to organize a car, driver, and guide for us. So we got a tour of the city that had become much more developed than it was when I was there. And we got to see various improvements that have been made during Mayor Yahav's 12-year terms. One of them was the beach at Haifa, where the municipality had installed these exercise machines so that citizens of the city could improve their figures. This gentleman is the most famous potato seller in Israel. And I thought that was actually pretty funny. Our guide took us to the market and told us that we had to see this individual for whom people came from all over Israel to buy potatoes. And I thought it was kind of interesting that only in Israel, a country of high technology and Nobel Prize winners, would there also be a place for a distinguished potato seller.
Potatoes taste the best.
So this woman was peeling some sort of vegetable. I couldn't really identify it in the Arab market in Haifa. And she was sitting there in 2019 when I took this picture, almost exactly in the same place and wearing the same dress as when I saw her about 5 years earlier. So I figured I had to take her picture. She was there for a reason, so that this was a sign to photograph her. This gentleman is a sandlar, a shoemaker. I needed a repair on one of my shoes, and we were directed to this sandlar shop on the Carmel. He and I chatted while I waited for the glue to dry, and he kept working on other repairs. He was very proud of his 100-year-old foot treadle-operated sewing machine that he uses every day, and that someone had brought from Germany in the 1920s or 30s. And a little story here about Yonah Yahav, the former mayor of Haifa. We went to visit him when he was still in office in the municipal building and just waltzed into the city hall of Haifa. Just no bag check, no ID, just three people with backpacks and a camera bag. And I was kind of shocked because you walk into a little store in Israel and they demand to look at the inside of a bag. So here, we just waltzed in. And at one point, we were having coffee with the mayor, and I asked him why there was so little security. He laughed at me. He said, "Who wants to kill me in Haifa, except maybe my wife?" So that was the mayor of Haifa. So from other places in Israel, this is, bless you, Zugesund. This is the market in Ramla. This is a huge sort of outdoor bazaar where there are formal stands and food places, as well as stuff that you wouldn't want to buy scattered on the sand or from the trunks of people's cars. And I was walking past this clothing place and saw this woman completely covered in a burqa where I could only see her eyes, and she was fishing around in her purse for something. And this is what I call a classic Leica shot, because the camera is quiet and quick and totally discreet. I never would have gotten this picture if I'd used something noisy, and I might have had an unpleasant confrontation. But the Leica is absolutely perfect for these hit and run things that I like doing. This was in a shopping mall in Beersheba that we needed to make a pit stop while driving through Beersheba. And our driver suggested that the mall would have the nicest facilities. And I saw this guy with his automatic rifle slung over his shoulder, probably waiting for somebody who was trying on clothing. And it brought me back to the reality of life in Israel. And this mall, this shopping mall, looks like an American shopping mall. The word for them is canyon. And here was a guy with his automatic rifle, and it brought me back to the reality of life in Israel. Sukkot in Zikron Yaakov. That Sukkot week is a nonstop festival in Israel. That's one of the reasons that I like going there, because people are off from work and it's a very festive time. And very often the activities spill into the street, like this scene with the clown, the musicians, and the Orthodox folks holding the lulav and etrog. They were all part of the spectacle in the street. Tzfat, the mystical city of Tzfat up in the north of Israel. I'd wanted to see Tzfat for a long time. Somehow it just never worked out to get there on the various trips. But finally in 2018, I was able to visit the city. And as you can see, it's an up and down kind of place that is on multiple levels with steep stairways. And one of the people we met there said that nobody needs a stair stepper for exercise in Tzfat, as the picture shows. And most of my Israel photography has been done in urban settings. And previously, I had only been to a working kibbutz in the northern Negev. In 2019, we made plans to stay with friends on kibbutz Grofit, which is deep in the Arava desert, almost to the end of Israel, almost to Eilat. And the Arava looks like a lunar landscape, absolutely arid desert, except for where there are the kibbutzim, where there are these green spots of agriculture. And it's a harsh place with temperatures upwards of 120 degrees in the summer. And Kibbutz Grofit had just closed its swimming pool because the fall temperature didn't get much above 90, and it was too cool for the kibbutzniks to go swimming. And Grofit raises cows and chickens and has extensive date orchards that go right down to the peaceful border with Jordan. And I photographed this cow, which was an Israeli cow that was curious about me and came right up to where I was standing. And looking at her sweet face, I began to feel guilty for occasionally eating red meat. But our host set me straight. He said that if I'd ever actually been around cows or worked with them, not only would I not feel guilty about eating beef, but I would consider it justifiable revenge. It seems that cows can be treacherous animals. I mean, who would have believed with a face like that? But they can be treacherous, and they've been known to crush or trample the people who work with them. So Kibbutz Grofit has these very extensive date orchards, and it's a huge agribusiness in the Arava, and the kibbutz has this highly mechanized system for harvesting the dates. That this cherry picker platform goes up to the top of the tree with the branches on it. The branches filled with dates drop into that hopper below, and then people sort them, and then the whole thing moves to the next set of trees like a mechanical ballet. This is the sorting, where standing behind these people, I had to dodge the rejects being thrown over their shoulders. A new industry or a new mini business that started on a nearby kibbutz Keturah, is a microbrewery that the kibbutz has a center for agricultural research for plants that grow in brackish water from artesian wells. And they'd also started this brewery to diversify. And as I mentioned, until the trip to the Arava Desert, the furthest south that I'd been in Israel was the Negev. And this photo was taken at Kibbutz Urim in the northern Negev, in their cow milking facility. And milking was a super efficient operation. The cows were let in, hooked up to the milking apparatus, and then herded back out when the milking process was finished. All perfectly docile and well-behaved. My companion decided to join me in the pit that was below the cows, despite my repeated warnings, and I've said this to her for many years, that hanging out with a photographer is really a dangerous venture and that she needs to think twice about doing it. So a few minutes after this picture was taken, one of the cows lifted its tail and, how can I explain this to an educated, cultured audience, sprayed her with fecal matter from head to toe. But fortunately, she survived the incident, only a bit worse for the wear, and she's here with me for the presentation. So she survived. So to move on from cows, at the end of the trip in 2014, we were driving up to Tel Aviv from the south, and I'm a people photographer. I'm really not interested in the landscape or plants or any of that. So I figured that my work was done for the trip. And then we came around a bend in the road, and there was what looked like a mini Woodstock rock festival in the desert. Now, this was maybe 2 miles from the border with Gaza in October of 2014, just 2 months after the war in Gaza. So I couldn't pass up the opportunity to spend a few hours wandering around there and photographing. And there were young people camping out, and they offered to share their food with us. They were listening to music. And I think that this speaks volumes about Israeli resiliency of a society bouncing back and getting on with normal life right after war. But after seeing this scene of the mini rock festival or the mini Woodstock, I figured that I was really finished with photography for the trip, and I would just relax, maybe fall asleep on the way back. Our guide decided that we just had to see a restored Ottoman police fort that in the 19th century had guarded the road between Gaza and Beersheba. And I wasn't particularly interested, but it seemed harmless enough. So then I noticed, as we got close to the site, a very pregnant woman being photographed against the stonework of the building. I quickly sent my companion, who's a fluent Hebrew speaker, to ask to get permission to photograph her, and she agreed. So I especially like the contrast between the woman about to give birth to bring new life into Israel and the arid desert. I had trouble over this picture when I wanted to include it in an exhibit 5 or 6 years ago. It was objected to as being unsuitable for a gallery in a Hillel Center dining area where college-age students might see it. And I couldn't really figure out what the objection was. I figured that by the time they got to college, they would know where babies came from. So I was kind of angry at this censorship, and I insisted that either she stayed in the exhibit or I would pull the whole thing. However, when I calmed down a bit, I did offer them an alternative for the dining hall. A picture from the meat market in the Arab quarter of Jerusalem with lamb carcasses hanging, covered with flies, and a guy sitting under them smoking a cigarette. So in the end, they agreed and let me keep her in the show. So these pictures, these are taken, these are scans, incidentally, from actual darkroom printed black and white prints. And they've had quite a life over the last few years. The pictures have been on the East and West Coast, and then in the Midwest, and in the Southwest, as well as a parallel collection of these, and there are about 24 of them in the collection, that were exhibited at the Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem, and then in synagogues in Paris and in Nice in France. And the way I work is in a sort of quiet. I should show you the like, actually. That's what I should do. This, if you can see it, is this is one of my two little Leica cameras. And as you can see, it's a little thing for people used to having cameras with large lenses stuck in their faces. I mean, this is just a little discrete camera, and basically nobody pays that much attention to me. I'm an old guy with an old camera, so nobody cares. And the thing that I love about it is that it's incredibly quiet. I mean, this is the shutter. It makes almost no noise, and people don't notice it. So from here, this is the start of the process. I also develop and print black and white film in old-fashioned chemicals and a darkroom, because silver-based film, and this is instead of zeros and ones, this is a process based on bits of silver being sensitized to light. And I work in the tradition of the street and documentary photographers. I record unposed found images for the most part. And I'm a great believer in happy accidents. The images are just there for me. And if everything goes right and I do my job, I can capture them. Sometimes I ask permission to take a picture, like in this case. In a number of situations, I really didn't and don't, because I have this probably unrealistic sense that the world is put out there for me to photograph. And that, yes, if necessary, I'll ask permission, but very often I don't. So the compulsion to photograph is often too much for me, and I just do it. This combination of camera, technique, and materials gives a classic, gritty, and timeless look to photographs. And so far, silver-based photography is the only medium that has a several hundred-year archival life, that if I don't live forever, this work that I do is liable to outlive me. So and with darkroom printed images, each one is a unique handmade object that can never be duplicated exactly, which is a large part of the beauty of traditional black and white photography. I worked for a long time as a photographer for an agency of the city of New York, where everything was done with that newfangled digital and video. I had to do it. Occasionally, I would bring one of the Leicas along on a photo gig when I thought something might be interested. Several times I would be asked, what can that old camera do the digital can't? And if I didn't want to give an explanation about, well, I want to be part of a 180-year artistic continuum, and I like the tactile. If I didn't feel like giving a whole long explanation, I would just say, it makes me happier than digital. That would be my explanation. Actually, I'm grateful to digital because it turned my old-fashioned medium into an art form. So anyway, that is the end of this part of the program. I would be delighted to answer any questions that you might have about my working style or the camera, and my able assistant here. Well, I see this gentleman with his hand up in the back there, and a microphone is coming along to you instantly so that everybody can hear.
Thank you. Thank you. So my question is, when you walk into a street scene or a marketplace looking to photograph people or street scenes, what are you thinking?
What am I thinking?
What are you trying? What's going through your mind?
Generally, it's funny. It's a very good question. In a lot of ways, after 45 years or so of doing this, it's a subliminal process that very often I don't know why something appeals to me, but it does. It's like what the judge once said about pornography. I don't have a description of it, but I know it when I see it. So that it's really, you might say it's an automatic subliminal process based on 45 years of experience. That I wish I had an answer for you. I wish I had it codified, but I don't. It's just there, and it sometimes appeals and sometimes doesn't. Another question? Somebody, somewhere? Yes, this gentleman in the far corner there.
The way you do all the photography, like, why did you even start doing it in the first place? What keeps you doing it?
Why did I start doing it in the first place? Well, I'll tell you. When I was 9 years old was the centennial, the 100-year anniversary of the American Civil War. And there were all of these books with the horses, steamships, cannon. It was all there for this 9-year-old little boy to enjoy. And I thought to myself, this is what I want to do. I want to preserve instants out of time. I want to make historical documents of time, because time is always passing, and something that I photographed 20 years ago, 9/11, for example, I happen to be there, is now part of history, and that's why I wanted to do it. It's my bid for immortality, maybe. So, another question somewhere, somebody? Yes, here.
I'm wondering how you balance these two things. One, asking somebody's permission and losing the candidness of the moment. And on the other hand, not asking permission, but perhaps invading somebody's privacy.
It's a delicate balance between asking permission and not. And lately, I've been doing a project, ongoing project for the last couple of years in New York City on documenting the pandemic. And I have pretty much assiduously been asking people permission. 9 out of 10 times they agree. it's, it's a balance. Again, it's a subjective and almost subliminal thing. Sometimes something appeals to me so much that the compulsion is there to photograph it without asking permission. And although lately, the last few years, I have been asking permission much more. So I would say these days, it's probably 80 to 20 in favor of asking permission.
So do you feel like it loses the candidness? Do you feel like it loses the candidness of the photo when you do that?
The candidness of the question was, do I lose the sense of the candidness of the photos? Sometimes yes, and other times the expression on people's faces, their eyes, their attitudes, someone, I don't know, working in a mask and gloves is poignant enough. It varies. Again, it's like what I said, it's what comes my way. And it's not a set thing. Although lately, I have to say the pandemic has made me much braver about going up to people and asking to photograph them. So yes, there's a lady over here. A technical question. I hope I can.
What I like best about your work is that the full range of light and dark in each picture. How do you achieve that? Because it's not always the same time of day when you're taking a picture.
How do I get the full range of light to dark? Generally, it's the judgment of what film will do. I have settled on just a couple of film stocks, of kinds of film, and I know what they will do under all circumstances. So while no, it's not instant gratification like digital, I have a pretty good idea of what I'll get. And also, you have to realize, I print my own work in a darkroom, so I have a tremendous amount of flexibility in terms of what can be done with the final product, with the materials. So, Rabbi.
You talk about being in this tradition of street photography, and I remember from whatever little photography I did, Henry Cartier-Bresson's genius was being able to snap that photo at just that moment. And we've come into an era where with digital film and the lack of cost of taking photos, where a lot of contemporary photographers will just hold the button down or take dozens and dozens of photos because they're free. What's your method in those two poles?
Well, my method in balancing photography, for one thing, with this, I'm limited to a maximum of 36 exposures before I have to take the camera apart and put in a new roll of film. So I have to be a little bit selective, and I have to get out of the scattergun mentality that I developed when I was working in digital and had endless amounts of space on a card. I've become more selective. I've decided that I'll take 2 exposures rather than a half dozen. And because a 1960 camera doesn't have the provision for motor drive, and I've never used one anyway, it's a matter of just, advancing and firing, advancing and firing. And it's, again, as I said, a certain amount of it is good luck, and a lot of it is luck that I've made from 45 years of doing it. Question? Yes, there's a young lady over here. Wait a second. The microphone will be right there.
I think we have it working now.
Do you have any advice for photographers that aren't as experienced?
Advice for someone who wants to work like I do with film? I do. Get yourself It's a limited investment. The old cameras of the 1970s and 80s were practically bulletproof. They will last forever, and they're very inexpensive. So basically, get yourself a simple mechanical single lens reflex camera and expect to burn up $500 of film before you get anywhere. It's a learning process. I tell people on the occasions whenever I teach photography that I can teach anybody how to use a camera and make a print in maybe a half hour, but it's liable to take the rest of your life to become an artist with a camera. So hopefully that doesn't discourage you, but it's like your first step into a process. We have another question over here.
Storage like SSDs and memory cards and getting like digital camera devices like smartphones or full-fledged computers with enough storage could also, and you could expect to work up like $1,000.
Well,
before you get beautiful pictures and you just use
the advantage of using these old cameras is that there are a lot of them around and they're very inexpensive. If you decide that you don't want to do this, you can put the camera on the shelf, and look at it, or give it to somebody else, and you're out very little. So, yes.
Whose stuff do you like?
Pardon?
Whose stuff? Who do you like?
Whose work do I like? Well, the rabbi mentioned Cartier-Bresson, who was a French photographer, who really is sort of the spiritual father of all of us, all of us who wander around in the street with Leicas. There's a photographer by the name of Roman Vishniak, who worked in Eastern Europe just before the Shoah and documented life that just a few years later was totally obliterated. He and several others influenced me to do Jewish documentary work because things vanish like that, as we know. Several people who use equipment that I don't use, but I tremendously respect. The old-fashioned cameras that sit on a tripod and use 4x5 or 8x10 inch single plates of film. There was a woman who documented New York in the 1930s as it changed into a city of skyscrapers by the name of Berenice Abbott. I have a tremendous amount of respect for her and the work she did. It's something I would never do. I mean, this is about as heavy of a thing as I want to carry around, not 40 pounds of a camera and tripod and holders. So, yes, there is. Where is my?
Next year is Israel's 75th anniversary. And I was wondering what maybe 3 or 5 shots you would love to get.
What, in Israel's 75th birthday, what 3 to 5 shots would you want to preserve or capture from that event?
If this were Israel's, I think I would like to show the diversity of people. I would like to go into some other place where Jews from all over the world were together in some situation. I would love to go onto an army base, which is almost impossible, and photograph a platoon of people from a wide variety of cultures. Maybe even though I really don't love high technology, I'd like to go into a laboratory, a hospital, something cutting edge. I'm also fascinated by the life of the Israeli Arabs I've never really been in those cities, and I think the next trip, I'm going to try to do that. Also, to get away from what's considered the tourist path. I'd like to go into development towns. I'd like to go to places where people are living in makeshift housing and trailers. So I don't know, whatever's interesting comes my way. Did I see another hand somewhere? Yes, there's.
It doesn't fit us. Oh, yeah.
Are we good for time? Are we okay?
Time for a call.
Okay. Let's.
I was wondering if you've ever taken a picture of someone and then they've told you their story, or you've become good friends with them through photography?
It's hard to have taken a photograph of somebody and have they then shared their story and you've become good friends with them?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, the answer is yes. I've been photographing rallies recently in favor, in support of Ukraine. And I've shown up at a number of these places recently, this is just over the last few months. And I actually have become sort of friendly with people. I'll go out and have a meal with them or a cup of coffee or something like that. And a number of them have very interesting stories, including recently I was photographing at one of these and there was a woman probably in her 30s who was using an old film camera, even more primitive than this. And we got to talking and I told her about my work in Israel. And she told me that she was from Ukraine, from Odessa, and told me that she had a Jewish grandfather who told her stories about how he survived World War II in hiding. So I do become sort of friendly with people and I see them on a regular basis. Occasionally I see another film photographer and I have sort of made friends with people like that as well. So we have, yes.
My question is, you take a picture at a certain moment in time of the mood and thought process of an artist. When you travel into your garden with a different mood and time, you might be in a different mood. Does that mood impact how that art ultimately comes out, or is it effectively a frozen image regardless of the mood in the dark room? It doesn't impact at the moment it was taken, or does that development process change based on when you're in that room, that moment?
The question was how do my perceptions change from one?
Yeah, you walk in the dark, you walk in the dark, you know, it could be 3 weeks later, you get a bad mood. Anything that'll happen, right? How that changes the
Very often, sometimes it's not even just a matter of weeks, it's a matter of years. Sometimes I will reprint something that maybe I did 20 or 25 years ago. And I'm different, my experiences are different, I'm older, I've certain things have happened, I've had certain successes and disappointments, and that is also reflected. Perhaps if I photograph something in a light tone, it's become darker because it might reflect my mood. A lot of this, again, is very, very subjective. And art is about the artist, not about the subject. That's all I can tell you. And things change and perceptions change. So we have one final question. Okay.
Is there any?
I hope not. You should go to advertising.
Photograph, and when you're home and you see something, just that is a great photograph, but if something falls, someone taking a child, would you not do it?
The question was, would I photograph some horrible scene? In general, I have a limit. I have a boundary. I don't photograph homeless people. I don't photograph street accidents. I don't photograph, I don't know, injured animals, things like that. These are, those are sensational photographs, and I'm not sure that they show what my vision of the world is. So I self-censor to a certain extent, yes.
I guess because I was thinking a little bit about the Civil War photographs, you know, and how I don't think they're sensational, I think it's like horrible. They're beautiful photographs, and I just, but I guess, you know, I guess.
I don't think it would be it would not be my style to take a beautiful photograph of a horrible scene. But that's just me. I mean, that people do it. Look at the news, that it's filled with horrible things. Whether they're beautiful or not, I don't know. But there's no end of horror to photograph. I just don't do it. So. Okay.
I really like that last question. I was listening, I think, to a segment on BBC about war photographers and how do we, what of the world that we see do we want to capture, and what of the world that we see do we want to explain? So I want to, with that as a segue, bring up another opportunity for an Israel 360 program taking place on Monday, May 23rd, which is very much about how do you see the world and how do you respond it. We're very pleased that we're going to have Lachav Harkov, who is a senior contributing editor and diplomatic correspondent for the Jerusalem Post. And she's going to be presenting from covert operations to overt negotiations, the Israeli and American responses to the Iranian nuclear threat. And I know that many of us are aware of the ongoing nature of that, of the United States shifting responses, and Israel's concern with its safety and the red line that a nuclear Iran poses. So her responsibilities include reporting on and analyzing Israel's relations with the world, the Prime Minister's office, the National Security Council, the Foreign Ministry, and more. And she's quite accomplished. She's interviewed major figures across the Israeli political spectrum, is well connected to country's top lawmakers and diplomats. She is used as a top expert and analyst on outlets such as the BBC, France 24, Sky News. They've all sought her analysis of breaking news. She's originally from New Jersey, made Aliyah at the age of 17, did her national service in Israel, and continued on from there. So that will be a Zoom-based event. We're co-sponsoring it with the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland, and it's really going to be a special occasion with a remarkable figure. We try to keep getting better, and so on the way out, you'll see a green placard. You can look behind you, and Lisa's holding it up, which has a QC code, and you can do that to get access so you can review this program. Paul Margolis was excellent. Any problems with the rabbi or anyone else, you can include in there. But we're very, very grateful to you, Paul and Aliyah, for coming out here. Tonight we're 10, 15 minutes away from sunset, where we move from Yom HaZikaron to Yom HaAtzmaut, the Israeli Memorial Day, into the Day of Independence. And so we're grateful we were able to schedule this event at this fulcrum point in Israeli life, the fulcrum point where you go from frozen moments in time of memory, of loss and sacrifice, into the hopes of freedom. And I think this year, as all of our eyes and hearts are also glued on Ukraine and the power of freedom and that hope, the loss and the sacrifice involved in it speaks to us particularly strongly as Jews, as Americans, as citizens of the world. So I want to thank everyone. I really want to give a special thanks to all the Israeli 360 committee. I was away gallivanting, taking my much more primitive photos on a much more advanced cell phone camera while they were really working hard to bring this event to fruition. So thank you all and Lisa and the entire staff. Thanks for coming out tonight.